Maurice Watson, a 29-year-old security officer at Silverwind Airport, was about to start what seemed like just another routine shift. Little did he know, his encounter with a mysterious elderly gentleman would change everything. Impeccably dressed and clutching a bouquet of wilting roses, the old man had been waiting at the airport for days. His unwavering presence had become a subject of curiosity and speculation among the airport staff and passengers. When Maurice finally approached him, the shocking truth he uncovered made his blood run cold. In an instant, he was calling for backup, knowing that every second counted. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The early morning sun barely peeked through the expansive windows of Silverwind Airport as Maurice Watson, 29, began his usual morning shift as a security officer. The airport was just starting to stir, with the first wave of travelers trickling in, their rolling suitcases creating a soft rumble against the polished floor. Maurice adjusted his crisp black-blue uniform, smoothing out a wrinkle as he surveyed the gradually filling terminal. He'd been working here for 5 years now, and the once exciting bustle of the airport had faded into a predictable hum of activity. The faces changed daily, but the rhythm remained the same, a constant ebb and flow of arrivals and departures, hellos and goodbyes. As he made his way through the arrivals hall, Maurice noticed the usual mix of people. There were businessmen in sharp suits, their eyes glued to smartphones, families with excited children craning their necks to spot familiar faces, and weary travelers shuffling along with drooping shoulders and bleary eyes. It was a tapestry of human experiences, all woven together in this transient space. Maurice's gaze swept across the rows of benches, a practiced routine of observation. That's when he first noticed him, an elderly man, likely in his 80s, sitting alone on one of the benches. There was something about him that made Maurice pause for a moment. The man was impeccably dressed in an elegant beige jacket that spoke of care and dignity. His posture, though slightly stooped with age, retained a certain pride. But it was the bouquet of vibrant red roses resting on his lap that truly caught Maurice's attention. Next to the man lay a small travel pillow, a hint of practicality amid the formality of his appearance. As Maurice watched, the elderly man's eyes scanned the crowd, a mixture of hope and anxiety evident in his gaze. There was an air of anticipation about him, as if he was waiting for someone special. Maurice couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen this man before, perhaps yesterday, but he couldn't be certain. In the constant flow of people through the airport, faces often blurred together. Just as Maurice was about to continue his rounds, the elderly man caught his eye and gestured for his attention. There was a gentleness in the motion that made Maurice approach without hesitation. "Excuse me, young man," the elderly gentleman said, his voice soft but clear. "I don't mean to bother you, but could you tell me when Flight 335 will be arriving?" Maurice was taken aback by the man's polite tone. It was a refreshing change from the often impatient travelers he dealt with daily. "I'm sorry, sir," Maurice replied with a smile. "As security, I don't have access to the flight schedules, but if you look over there," he pointed to a large digital board on the far wall, "you'll find all the arrival times listed." The elderly man's face lit up with gratitude. "Oh, thank you so much. I'm terribly sorry to have disturbed you. It's just that I'm waiting for someone very special, and I wouldn't want to miss her arrival for the world." The man's words, filled with anticipation and a hint of nervousness, touched something in Maurice. He found himself smiling genuinely, affected by the man's obvious excitement and politeness. "No problem at all, sir. I hope you meet your special someone soon. Good luck." As Maurice walked away, continuing his rounds, he found the smile lingering on his face. The encounter had been brief, but there was something about the elderly man's demeanor, a remnant of a generation that valued courtesy and patience, that left a warm impression. Maurice filed the moment away as a pleasant part of his routine, never suspecting that this simple interaction would soon become the catalyst for a profound change in his life. The day progressed as it usually did for Maurice. He dealt with the usual array of minor conflicts and concerns that came with his job: misplaced luggage, confused travelers, and the occasional security hiccup. By the time his shift was ending, Maurice was looking forward to heading home and unwinding. As he walked out of the security room, his mind already on the quiet evening ahead, Maurice found himself passing through the arrivals hall once more. The space had changed since morning, now filled with the warm golden light of the setting sun streaming through the windows. The crowd had thinned considerably, with only a few stragglers remaining. That's when Maurice saw him again, the elderly man from the morning. He was still sitting in the exact same spot, the bouquet of roses still carefully cradled in his lap. The sight made Maurice pause in his tracks. The old man's eyes were still scanning the thinning crowd, but there was a weariness to his posture that hadn't been there in the morning. The hope in his eyes seemed dimmer, tinged with a growing anxiety that Maurice could sense even from a distance. Before he could stop himself, Maurice called out, "Sir, did you manage to find the person you were waiting for?" The elderly man turned at the sound of Maurice's voice. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something. Disappointment? Embarrassment? Across his face before he replied softly, "I'm still waiting. She should be here soon." He paused, then added with a forced smile, "Have a nice evening." Maurice, now at the exit, raised his hand in a farewell wave. "You too, sir. Take care." As Maurice stepped out into the warm evening air, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling the encounter had left him with. He made his way to his car, the image of the waiting man replaying in his mind. On the drive home, Maurice found his thoughts continually circling back to the elderly man. It was odd, wasn't it, for someone to be waiting that long? Maybe the flight had been delayed, he reasoned. But then, wouldn't the man have known that from the arrival board Maurice had pointed out to him? The more Maurice thought about it, the more details stood out as peculiar. The travel pillow the man had with him, was that a sign he had been prepared for a long wait, or could it mean something else entirely? Maurice briefly entertained the idea that the man might be homeless, seeking shelter in the airport, but that theory didn't fit with the man's elegant attire and the carefully maintained bouquet of roses. Maurice shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts. It was probably nothing, he told himself, just an unfortunate delay or mix-up. These things happened all the time in airports. Still, as he navigated the evening traffic, Maurice couldn't completely banish the image of the elderly man, sitting alone and waiting, from his mind. Maurice's apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. He sat at his small dining table, pushing the remains of his reheated lasagna around his plate. The TV droned on in the background, but Maurice wasn't really watching it. His mind kept drifting back to the airport, to the elderly man with his bouquet of roses. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through social media without really seeing it. Usually this nightly routine helped him unwind, but tonight it felt hollow. The posts and photos of his friends and acquaintances seemed trivial compared to the mystery that had planted itself in his mind. Maurice put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He tried to rationalize the situation again. Airports were places of waiting, after all. Delays happened all the time. The old man's loved one could have been stuck in transit, or there could have been a miscommunication about arrival times. But something about that explanation didn't sit right with Maurice. The man had been there in the morning, and he was still there when Maurice left in the evening. That was an awfully long delay, wasn't it? Maurice got up and started pacing his small living room. He replayed the interactions in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed. The man's polite demeanor, the careful way he held the roses, the mix of hope and anxiety in his eyes. It all painted a picture of someone eagerly anticipating a reunion. But then why hadn't anyone come? As he paced, Maurice's eyes fell on a framed photo on his bookshelf. It was a picture of him with his late grandmother, taken just a few months before she passed away. The sight of it stopped him in his tracks. His grandmother had been alone in her final years, her children busy with their own lives, her friends gradually passing on. Maurice remembered the loneliness he'd seen in her eyes sometimes, even when she smiled and insisted she was fine. The memory sent a pang through his heart. Was that what he'd seen in the old man's eyes? Not just anticipation, but a deeper, more profound loneliness. Maurice shook his head, trying to dispel the thought. He was projecting, wasn't he? Seeing connections where there might not be any. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than a simple, delayed meeting. As he got ready for bed, Maurice found his thoughts continually circling back to the airport. He brushed his teeth mechanically, his mind replaying every detail of his encounters with the elderly man. The polite way he'd asked about the flight, the gentle grip on the bouquet of roses, the weary but hopeful look in his eyes at the end of the day. Maurice climbed into bed, hoping that sleep would provide a respite from his swirling thoughts. But as he lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded him. The image of the old man sitting alone on that bench kept floating before his eyes. What if the person never came? What if the old man was still there, waiting through the night? The thought made Maurice's stomach clench with worry. He rolled over, punching his pillow in frustration. This was ridiculous. He didn't even know the man. Why was he so bothered by this? But deep down, Maurice knew why. It was the vulnerability he'd sensed, the quiet dignity in the face of what might be crushing disappointment. It reminded him of his grandmother in her final years, of the loneliness that could engulf the elderly when the world moved too fast around them. As the night wore on, Maurice drifted into a fitful sleep. His dreams were a confused jumble of airport terminals and lonely benches, of wilting roses and missed connections. Through it all, the figure of the old man waited, a silent sentinel in a sea of transient faces. When Maurice's alarm went off the next morning, he awoke feeling unrested, the unease of the night still clinging to him like a shroud. As he got ready for his shift, he made a silent promise to himself. Today he would get to the bottom of this mystery. He owed it to himself and to the kind old man who had stirred something deep within him to find out what was really going on. The early morning air was crisp as Maurice made his way into Silverwind Airport. He'd arrived earlier than usual, driven by a mixture of curiosity and concern that had followed him from his restless night. The airport was quiet at this hour, with only a handful of early travelers and the night shift staff preparing to clock out. As Maurice walked through the arrivals hall, a sense of déjà vu washed over him. His steps slowed as he approached the area where he'd seen the elderly man yesterday. From a distance, he could make out a figure on the same bench, and his heart began to race. Drawing closer, Maurice's suspicions were confirmed. It was indeed the same elderly man, but the sight of him now made Maurice's chest tighten with concern. The man was asleep, his head resting on the small travel pillow Maurice had noticed yesterday. The bouquet of roses, now noticeably wilted, still lay in his lap, protected even in sleep by loosely curled fingers. Maurice stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. The man's elegant beige jacket was slightly rumpled now, his polished shoes scuffed from a day of waiting. In sleep, his face looked older, more vulnerable. The lines of worry and hope that had animated it yesterday now slack with exhaustion. A wave of emotions washed over Maurice, concern, sadness, and a growing sense of unease. This man had clearly spent the night in the airport. While it wasn't unheard of for people to wait long hours for delayed flights, spending the night went beyond the usual. Something was definitely wrong here. Maurice was tempted to wake the man, to ask him what was going on and if he needed help. But he hesitated, looking at the peaceful face of the sleeping elderly man. After what had likely been a long and disappointing day of waiting, followed by an uncomfortable night on an airport bench, Maurice couldn't bring himself to disturb what little rest the man was getting. Instead, Maurice continued to his security room, his mind churning with questions and concerns. As he changed into his uniform, he couldn't shake the image of the sleeping man from his mind. The wilted roses, the rumpled clothes, the weary slump of his shoulders even in sleep, it all painted a picture of prolonged disappointment that tugged at Maurice's heart. Clocking in for his shift, Maurice made a silent promise to himself. He would keep an eye on the elderly man throughout the day. If the situation hadn't changed by the afternoon, he would have to intervene, regardless of how awkward or intrusive it might feel. Something was clearly not right, and Maurice felt a growing sense of responsibility to get to the bottom of it. Maurice began his rounds, his thoughts constantly returning to the sleeping figure on the bench. Who was this man waiting for so patiently? Why hadn't they come? And most importantly, what could Maurice do to help? The day stretched ahead, filled with the usual tasks and responsibilities, but for Maurice it was now underscored by a quiet tension. He found himself glancing at the clock more often than usual, counting down the hours until he could check on the elderly man again. In quiet moments between his duties, Maurice found himself imagining various scenarios. Maybe the man was waiting for a long-lost love, reuniting after years apart. Or perhaps it was an estranged family member, and wires had gotten crossed about the meeting time. Each possibility Maurice considered seemed to raise more questions than answers. As lunchtime approached, Maurice made up his mind. He would check on the man again, and this time he would engage him in conversation. He needed to understand what was happening, and more importantly, he needed to make sure the elderly gentleman was all right. With a mix of determination and apprehension, Maurice headed back towards the arrivals hall. Whatever was going on with this mysterious waiting man, Maurice was now committed to seeing it through. Little did he know that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge his perceptions, test his compassion, and ultimately change his life forever. As Maurice approached the bench where the elderly man had been sleeping earlier, he found him now awake and alert. The man's eyes, though tired, still held that mixture of hope and anxiety that Maurice had noticed before. The bouquet of roses, now visibly wilted, remained clutched in his lap like a lifeline. Maurice took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. He knew he had to be careful, respectful of the man's privacy, while also addressing his growing concerns. "Excuse me, sir," Maurice began, his voice gentle but firm. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right? I couldn't help but notice you've been here since yesterday." The elderly man looked up, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he saw Maurice in his security uniform. For a moment, he seemed startled, as if suddenly realizing how long he had been there. "Oh, yes, yes," he replied, his voice a bit hoarse from disuse. "Everything's fine, young man. I'm just waiting for someone. They'll be here soon, I'm sure of it." Maurice nodded, but he couldn't shake his concern. He decided to press a little further. "Sir, I don't mean to pry, but you've been here for quite a while. Have you had anything to eat? Is there someone I can call for you?" The elderly man's face softened at Maurice's evident concern. "You're very kind to ask, but really I'm fine. My friend will be here any moment now. I don't want to miss her arrival." Maurice hesitated, then decided to take a more direct approach. "Sir, I apologize if this seems forward, but I need to ask, do you have a place to go? The airport isn't really a place for extended stays, you see." At this, the elderly man's composure faltered slightly. A look of distress briefly crossed his face before he regained his calm demeanor. "Oh no, young man, you misunderstand. I'm not homeless, if that's what you're thinking. I have a lovely home, it's just, well, it's very important that I'm here when she arrives." Maurice nodded, relieved to hear that the man wasn't homeless but still troubled by the situation. "I understand, sir, but perhaps we could find a more comfortable place for you to wait, or maybe we could check on the status of the flight you're waiting for." The elderly man shook his head, a gentle but firm refusal. No, that won't be necessary. I'm quite comfortable here, and I'm sure she'll be here soon. Very soon." There was something in the man's tone, a mixture of hope and desperation, that tugged at Maurice's heart. He realized that pushing further at this point might only cause the man to shut down completely. "All right, sir," Maurice conceded, "but please, if you need anything, water, food, or any kind of assistance, don't hesitate to ask for me. My name is Maurice, and I'll be here all day." The elderly man smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes despite his obvious fatigue. "Thank you, Maurice. You're a good young man. Your parents must be proud." As Maurice walked away, his mind was racing. The conversation had done little to allay his concerns. If anything, it had deepened them. The man clearly wasn't going to leave voluntarily, and while he wasn't breaking any rules per se, his prolonged stay was unusual and potentially concerning. Maurice decided he would keep a close eye on the situation throughout his shift. He would ensure the man had water, and perhaps even bring him some food from the airport cafe. And if by the end of the day there was still no sign of the person he was waiting for, Maurice knew he would have to take more decisive action. Maurice found himself circling back to the elderly man's bench more frequently than his duties strictly required. Each time he passed, the man was there, alert and watchful, the wilting roses still cradled in his lap. The hope in his eyes seemed to dim a little more with each passing hour, replaced by a growing anxiety that Maurice found increasingly difficult to ignore. Finally, as his shift was nearing its end, Maurice made a decision. He couldn't leave without understanding more about this man's situation. With a mixture of determination and apprehension, he approached the bench once more. "Sir," Maurice began gently, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm concerned about you. You've been here for quite a while now. Is there anything I can do to help? Perhaps we could try to contact the person you're waiting for?" The elderly man looked up at Maurice, and for a moment it seemed as though he might brush off the concern again. But then, something in his expression changed. The facade of patient waiting crumbled, revealing a vulnerability that made Maurice's heart ache. "You're very kind, young man," the elderly gentleman said, his voice quavering slightly. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to talk about it. My name is Harold, by the way. Harold Thompson." Maurice sat down next to Harold, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough to hear the man's soft voice. "It's nice to meet you properly, Mr. Thompson. I'm Maurice Watson. Can you tell me about the person you're waiting for?" Harold's eyes lit up, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Her name is Alejandra. She's the most wonderful woman I've ever known." As Harold spoke, he pulled out his phone, his gnarled fingers moving with surprising dexterity across the screen. He pulled up a profile picture of an elderly woman, her silver hair framing a face creased with laugh lines, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "We've been dating online for 2 years now," Harold continued, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and longing. "Can you believe it? At my age, finding love again. It's a miracle." Maurice listened, a growing sense of unease building in his stomach. Online dating wasn't uncommon these days, but something about this situation felt off. Harold scrolled through his phone, showing Maurice text messages filled with warmth and affection. "We've never met in person before," he explained. "She lives in Africa, you see. But now she's finally coming here. She has cancer and she's coming for treatment. I'm going to help her, to take care of her." Maurice's heart sank as the pieces started to fall into place. He tried to keep his voice neutral as he asked, "Mr. Thompson, this must be expensive. The travel, the medical treatments." Harold nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, it is, but she's worth every penny. I've brought $30,000 in cash with me. It's everything I have, but what good is money if you can't use it to help the ones you love?" The alarm bells that had been ringing quietly in the back of Maurice's mind now blared at full volume. Cash, online dating, someone from another country needing money for medical treatments. It all pointed to one terrible conclusion. "Mr. Thompson," Maurice said carefully, "when was Alejandra supposed to arrive?" Harold's face fell. "Well, she was meant to come 2 days ago, but there was a problem with her flight in Africa. She needed more money to rebook her ticket, so I sent it to her. She should be here any moment now." Maurice felt a wave of sadness and anger wash over him. This kind, hopeful man had been taken in by a cruel scam. But how could he tell him? How could he shatter the hope that had kept Harold going for the past 3 days? Before Maurice could figure out how to proceed, Harold's phone buzzed. The old man's face lit up as he looked at the screen. "It's her," he exclaimed. "She says she's just landed and will be at the exit in 10 minutes. She's reminding me to bring the money." Harold beamed at Maurice. joy radiating from every line of his face. "You see? I told you she'd come. Love always finds a way." Maurice felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. He knew what was about to happen, the cruel finale of this elaborate scam. In that moment, he made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice firm but kind, "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Confused by Maurice's sudden shift in tone, Harold nodded hesitantly. "I'm going to take your phone for a moment, and I'm going to call for some help. I promise I'll explain everything. But right now, I need you to stay here and not go anywhere. Can you do that for me?" Harold's confusion deepened, but something in Maurice's earnest expression made him nod in agreement. With a heavy heart but a determined spirit, Maurice took the phone and stepped away. He quickly dialed for backup, explaining the situation to his fellow officers in hushed, urgent tones. As he spoke, he could see Harold on the bench, clutching his roses, his eyes fixed on the exit, waiting for a woman who would never come. Maurice knew that the next few minutes would shatter Harold's world, but he also knew that he couldn't stand by and let this kind old man be robbed of his life savings. With backup on the way, Maurice steeled himself for what was to come. The story that had been unfolding over the past 3 days was about to reach its climax, and Maurice was determined to ensure that, despite the heartbreak to come, it would not end in tragedy. His heart raced as he returned to the bench, knowing that backup was on the way. He glanced at Harold, who was still sitting on the bench, clutching his phone and the wilted bouquet of roses. The elderly man's eyes were fixed on the exit, a mixture of excitement and anxiety evident on his face. Maurice felt a pang of guilt, knowing what was about to unfold. Within minutes, Maurice's fellow officers began to arrive. They were dressed in plain clothes, blending seamlessly with the crowd of travelers. Maurice watched as they took up strategic positions near the exit, their movements casual but purposeful. He caught the eye of Officer Sarah Chen, giving her a subtle nod. She returned the gesture, signaling that the team was in place. Maurice turned back to Harold, who seemed oblivious to the sudden increase in undercover security personnel around him. The elderly man was fidgeting nervously, his eyes darting between his phone and the exit. "Mr. Thompson," Maurice said gently, "are you all right?" Harold looked up, a trembling smile on his face. "Oh, yes, just a bit nervous, I suppose. It's our first time meeting in person, you see. I hope I look like my photos." Maurice felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted nothing more than to tell Harold the truth, to protect him from the heartbreak that was coming. But he knew that right now the most important thing was to keep Harold safe and catch the criminals who had manipulated him. "I'm sure it will be fine," Maurice said, forcing a smile. "Now remember what I said. Stay right here, okay? No matter what happens, don't move from this spot. Can you promise me that?" Harold nodded, though he looked a bit confused by Maurice's insistence. "Of course, young man, but why?" "It's just airport procedure," Maurice lied smoothly. "For security reasons, trust me, okay?" As Harold agreed, Maurice's radio crackled softly. His team was ready and in position. The tension in the air was palpable as they waited for the scammers to make their move. Harold, still unaware of the drama unfolding around him, continued to watch the exit with eager anticipation. Maurice's hand moved to his concealed weapon. He hoped it wouldn't come to that, but he was prepared for any eventuality. The safety of Harold and the other civilians in the airport was his top priority. As the minutes ticked by, Maurice could feel the anticipation building. His team was ready, the trap was set, and now all they could do was wait for the scammers to walk right into it. The bustling airport continued its normal rhythm around them, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Maurice found himself studying Harold's face, noting the lines of hope and excitement etched there. It pained him to know that those same lines would soon be transformed into ones of disappointment and heartbreak. But he steeled himself, reminding himself that what they were doing was necessary to protect not just Harold, but potentially many other vulnerable individuals who might fall prey to these scammers. The waiting seemed interminable. Maurice checked his watch, then scanned the crowd again. His team remained vigilant. their eyes constantly moving, searching for any sign of the suspects. The airport's ambient noise, the chatter of travelers, the rolling of suitcases, the periodic announcements over the PA system, all faded into the background as Maurice's senses sharpened, focused entirely on the task at hand. And then finally, there was movement at the entrance from the parking lot. Maurice's pulse quickened as he spotted two men entering the airport, their eyes scanning the crowd with purpose. The newcomers, dressed in black jackets and caps, made their way through the crowd with deliberate casualness. Their eyes scanned the crowd, eventually landing on Harold. Maurice felt his pulse quicken. This was it. As they drew closer, Maurice could see them eyeing Harold, taking in the roses and the eager expression on his face. They exchanged a glance, a silent confirmation passing between them. Maurice's breath caught in his throat. He tensed, ready to spring into action. The next few moments would be crucial. He watched as Harold looked at the men in confusion, clearly not expecting to see them instead of Alejandra. "Now!" Maurice barked into his radio, springing forward. In an instant, the scene erupted into controlled chaos. Maurice's team converged on the two suspects with practiced efficiency. Officer Chen tackled the shorter man just as his hand emerged from his pocket, sending something skittering across the floor. A phone, not a weapon, Maurice noted with relief. The taller suspect tried to bolt, but he was quickly cornered by two other officers. Maurice himself stood protectively in front of Harold, who had frozen in shock, the roses tumbling from his grasp. "Airport security, don't move," Maurice shouted, his voice carrying authority that cut through the sudden commotion. Travelers nearby gasped and moved back, creating a circle of space around the unfolding scene. Some pulled out their phones, recording the incident, while others hurried away, not wanting to get involved. The two suspects, realizing they were outnumbered and cornered, raised their hands in surrender. Maurice could see the panic in their eyes, the realization that their scheme had spectacularly backfired. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Officer Chen commanded, her voice firm and authoritative. As the suspects complied, Maurice's team moved in to handcuff them. The sound of metal clicking into place seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet space. Maurice watched as his colleagues patted down the suspects, retrieving phones, wallets, and a small notebook that Maurice suspected contained details of their scam operations. Throughout the commotion, Maurice had kept one hand on Harold's shoulder, both to protect him and to prevent him from interfering. Now, with the immediate threat contained, he turned his full attention to the elderly man. Harold's face was a mask of confusion and dawning horror. His eyes darted between the arrested men and Maurice, struggling to comprehend what was happening. "Maurice," he said, his voice trembling. What's going on? Where's Alejandra?" Maurice felt his heart constrict at the lost look in Harold's eyes. He gently guided the older man back to the bench, helping him sit down. "Mr. Thompson, Harold," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm so sorry, but there is no Alejandra. These men," he gestured to the handcuffed suspects, "were trying to scam you, but you're safe now. We've got them." Harold's knees seemed to give out and he collapsed onto the bench. The reality of the situation seemed to crash down on him all at once. His shoulders slumped and tears welled up in his eyes. No, it can't be," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the renewed bustle of the airport. The roses lay scattered on the floor, their wilted petals a poignant reminder of Harold's shattered dreams. Maurice knelt down, gathering them up. As he held the battered bouquet, he made a silent promise to himself and to Harold. He would see this through no matter what it took. The commotion of the arrest faded, and the suspects were escorted away. Maurice and Harold remained on the bench, enveloped in a bubble of stunned silence amidst the airport's usual bustle. Harold's hands trembled as he reached for one of the fallen roses that Maurice had gathered. Its petals were bruised and wilting, a cruel metaphor for his own battered heart. "No, Alejandra," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was all a lie?" Maurice felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the elderly man grapple with the truth. "I'm so sorry, Harold," he said gently, sitting down next to him on the bench. "These scammers are professionals. They prey on kind-hearted people like you. It's not your fault." But Harold wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on his phone, which he'd pulled from his pocket with shaking hands. He began scrolling through the messages and photos he'd exchanged with Alejandra over the past 2 years. Each word, each image that had once brought him joy now twisted like a knife in his heart. "We talked every day," Harold said, his voice cracking with emotion. "She knew everything about me, my hopes, my fears, my dreams for the future. She said she loved me." He looked up at Maurice, his eyes brimming with tears and confusion. How could it all be fake? How could someone do this? Maurice struggled to find the right words. How could he explain the depths of human cruelty to someone whose heart was so full of love? "Harold, these scammers are skilled manipulators," he began carefully. "They take the time to build trust, to make their victims feel special and loved. But it's all a trick to get money. They don't care about the pain they cause." Harold's face crumpled as the full weight of the deception hit him. "The money," he whispered, looking down at the bag at his feet that contained his life savings. "I was going to give her everything. I thought I had found love again. After my wife passed, I never thought I'd feel this way again. And now..." The pain in Harold's voice was almost unbearable. Maurice found himself at a loss for words, faced with a grief so raw and immediate. He wanted to offer comfort, but what could he possibly say to ease this kind of betrayal? Harold clung to his phone, staring at Alejandra's profile picture, still desperate to believe. "Maybe she's real," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "Maybe she just got mixed up with these bad men. She could still be out there waiting for me. We had plans, Maurice. We were going to travel to see the world together." Maurice gently placed his hand over Harold's, lowering the phone. "Harold, I know this is hard to accept, but Alejandra isn't real. The person in those photos, the one you've been talking to, it was all part of the scam. Those men created her, used her to manipulate your feelings. I'm so sorry." The truth slowly sank in, and Harold's last defenses crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. The bouquet of roses lay forgotten on the bench beside them, a poignant symbol of his shattered dreams. Maurice sat with Harold, offering silent support as the elderly man grieved. Around them, the airport continued its ceaseless activity, travelers rushing past, oblivious to the heartbreak unfolding in their midst. A few curious onlookers cast sympathetic glances their way, but most hurried past, lost in their own journeys. As Harold's sobs gradually subsided, Maurice knew that the immediate crisis had passed, but the real work of healing was just beginning. The pain of this betrayal would linger, and the process of rebuilding trust and hope would be long and difficult. But as he sat there, a comforting hand on Harold's shoulder, Maurice made a silent vow. He wouldn't let Harold face this alone. Somehow he would help this kind-hearted man find his way through the darkness and hopefully towards a brighter future. The journey ahead would be challenging, but Maurice was determined to be there every step of the way. He gently squeezed Harold's shoulder, drawing the older man's attention. "Harold," Maurice said softly, his voice filled with compassion, "I know this is overwhelming right now, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. I'm here to help you through it, every step of the way." Harold looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and lost, his face etched with a pain that seemed to age him even further. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "Why would you want to help me? I'm just a foolish old man who fell for a trick. I should have known better." Maurice shook his head firmly, his eyes meeting Harold's with unwavering sincerity. "No, Harold, you're not foolish at all. You're a kind, loving person who believed in the goodness of others. That's not something to be ashamed of. If anything, the world needs more people like you, not fewer." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, pressing it gently into Harold's trembling hand. "Here's my number," Maurice explained. "I want you to call me any time, day or night, if you need to talk or if you need help with anything related to this situation. And I mean anything, Harold, whether it's questions about the legal process or just someone to listen when things get tough. Harold stared at the card, turning it over in his hands as if it was some precious artifact. A mix of gratitude and uncertainty played across his face. I don't know what to say, Maurice. You've already done so much. I couldn't possibly impose... Maurice cut him off gently. You're not imposing, Harold. I want to help. And there's something else we need to talk about. What happens next? Harold's expression turned apprehensive, but Maurice continued, his voice calm and reassuring. We're going to need to file a report about this scam, and you might need to speak with some investigators. I know it sounds daunting, but I'll be there with you every step of the way. We'll make sure your story is heard, and do everything we can to prevent these scammers from hurting anyone else. He paused, considering his next words carefully. And, Harold, I think it might be a good idea for you to talk to someone professionally about what you've been through. A counselor or therapist who specializes in helping victims of fraud. It can really help to process everything you're feeling. Harold nodded slowly, the weight of everything still evident in his posture. I suppose that might be a good idea, he admitted quietly. I feel so ashamed. How could I have been so gullible? Maurice leaned in, his voice firm but kind. Harold, listen to me. You have nothing to be ashamed of. These scammers are professionals. They exploit people's best qualities, their kindness, their hope, their capacity for love. You're a victim of a crime, nothing more. Harold's eyes welled up again, but this time there was a glimmer of something else beneath the tears. Gratitude, perhaps, or the first tiny spark of resilience. Maurice felt a surge of protectiveness. Recalling what Harold had shared earlier about his personal life, Maurice knew the elderly man had no family left, and the thought of this kind man facing the aftermath of the scam alone was unbearable. Harold, I know we've only just met, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, not just as a security officer, but as a friend. We're going to get through this together, okay? To Maurice's surprise, Harold reached out and pulled him into a hug. Thank you, the older man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for saving me from this and for caring. It means more than you know. Harold looked at Maurice, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You know, he said softly, his voice wavering slightly. I had started to think the world had changed too much, that young people today didn't care about us old folks anymore. He paused, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. But you've proved me wrong, Maurice. There's still kindness out there. Maurice felt a warmth spread through his chest at Harold's words. There's plenty of good people in every generation, Mr. Thompson. We just have to look out for each other. Maurice stood up, offering his hand to Harold. Come on, he said gently. Let's get you home. We can stop for a bite to eat on the way if you'd like, and we can talk more about the next steps. Or we can just sit quietly if that's what you need. As they walked out of the airport together, Maurice supporting Harold's slightly unsteady steps, he knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with legal proceedings, emotional hurdles, and the slow process of rebuilding trust and hope. But Maurice was determined to be there every step of the way. He had entered this situation as a security officer doing his job, but he was leaving it as a friend, committed to helping Harold navigate the challenging times ahead.